We're learning more about Biden's likely replacement for Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, who announced recently that he plans on retiring, giving Biden an opportunity to nominate a Supreme Court justice. That's great. Now, J. Michelle Childs is the favorite to replace Breyer. And there was a lot of complimentary coverage about her, complimentary commentary coming from the likes of Senator Lindsey Graham, a staunch Trump supporter and right winger. She has been endorsed by Representative Jim Clyburn. And so we were a little skeptical because there was very little talk about the substance behind this woman. What were her previous rulings as a judge? What kind of work did she do as a lawyer? Now we're learning quite a bit about how she's actually sided with employers over employees in various cases, including cases involving discrimination and sexual harassment. Now, at the law firm Nexon Pruitt, Childs worked primarily in labor and employment law, principally working on behalf of employers against allegations of racial discrimination, civil rights violations, and unionization drives. Now, I think it's important to remind you all that the reason why Jim Clyburn has been pushing for her is because he wants an African-American woman to serve on the Supreme Court, which is all fine and dandy, but what does it matter if it's an African-American woman when her work history includes fighting against employees who have experienced discrimination in the workplace? Now, Bloomberg Law has 25 cases registered in which Childs participated during her time at the firm. 23 of those involve alleged employment discrimination or other employment-related civil rights violations. Race and gender were common factors in such suits. 7 such cases entailed race-based job discrimination, and another 3 involved sex-based job discrimination. In all but 2 registered instances, Childs was not representing the plaintiff, but the defendant, meaning that she overwhelmingly represented employers accused of violating civil rights and gender discrimination laws in the workplace. Now, when Lindsey Graham was defending the possibility of her being nominated to replace Justice Breyer, he specifically mentioned her experience in labor law. And this is what he was referring to. Look, Lindsey Graham is not gonna endorse anyone who's actually fought for the workers. Let's keep it real. But we've got more on this, including a few specific cases where she represented the wrong people. But before we get to that, Cenk.
Yeah, so, and we're gonna show you what we said about it yesterday, because I think it's important for you guys to know how the news actually works and how you can see it for yourself and what honest reporting looks like. Okay, so in this case, look, let's give you a bunch of caveats that are important. Can someone be sued for discrimination and it's not true? Definitely, that's of course possible. So is it possible that someone is going through a unionization effort, but they need a lawyer? Well, that's not possible, that's definite. Whether you're in favor of the union or against the union, doesn't matter, you need a lawyer either way. And so why does she represent employers more often? Well, that's because they're the ones with all the money. And so all of that stuff within the legal world is fairly normal. But what we told you yesterday and what we're emphasizing today is, yes, but we don't have to pick that person, right? We have, presumably thousands of African-American women who are jurists in this country that you have to choose from. And that's only because Biden made that core promise on the campaign trail that it would be an African-American woman. You certainly have thousands of judges to choose from overall who could be great and have the perspective that we want and not have these issues, right? And here she seems to be overwhelmingly on the side of the employers, overwhelmingly on the side of defending discrimination. Were the people she was defending, they were right on all of those cases? Hey, I could see 1 or 2, but 23, and they were all right, or it's possible some of them did some terrible things. And I get it, it's her job to represent them, but if that's the perspective she's gonna come in with as a judge and then a Supreme Court justice and think, well, I know from my experience the employer is almost always right. Well, that's a pretty disastrous perspective to have, and you can't really pretty that up with identity politics.
Exactly.
And think you're curing it.
Well, look, Jake, we have specific cases where she represented the employer in accusations of discrimination and the employer lost. But before we get to that, I do want to also just note, Jim Clyburn made it abundantly clear during a recent interview on CNN that he was endorsing her because she's his favorite, but more importantly, he wants to ensure that Biden nominates someone who will get bipartisan support. That's very important to him, bipartisan support. Yeah, so why would any Biden SCOTUS nominee receive bipartisan support? There's only been one instance where there was bipartisan support for what Biden was pushing for, which was the corporate handout infrastructure bill, correct?
Yeah. So look, Clyburn's one of the most corrupt members of Congress. There isn't a corporate-backed bill that he wouldn't love and push for, and anything that's progressive, he's gonna go out of his way to try to kill. So if Clyburn's in, that means that pick is 100% corporate. They will not disagree with business interests, okay? But Lindsey Graham already said that he loved the pick. Lindsey Graham may be the only guy who's more pro-corporate than Clyburn in the whole country, and Clyburn, by saying, I need all Republicans to agree to it or enough Republicans to agree to it, is saying, I'm guaranteeing you a pro-corporate pick, because there's 0% chance that Republicans are gonna agree to someone who's on the side of labor.
Why can't we find, look, Biden made a campaign promise that he would pick an African-American woman for the Supreme Court. Great, why can't we pick someone who is both an African-American woman but has a history of, defending the very people that the Democratic Party claims to care about? Workers, the disenfranchised, individuals who've experienced discrimination in the workplace. They claim they care about those issues, but when push comes to shove, they'll give you the optics of change. They'll give you this, the pretty little, illusion of change. But in reality, it's more of the pro-corporate nonsense that we've come to expect. Now, I wanted to give you a few specific examples. In Green versus Kinesco Finance, for example, the plaintiff, an African-American woman, alleged race and pregnancy discrimination in a situation where the company denied her a promotion and then terminated her outright. Childs represented the employer, Kinesco. The case eventually resulted in a jury siding with the plaintiff, awarding her $193,000 in damages after Childs withdrew. But there's more. In Harris versus L&L Wings, a plaintiff alleged near daily sexual assault by a workplace supervisor for years. Childs represented the company. A jury eventually sided with Harris, the plaintiff, awarding damages and even attorney's fees.
So, and as a judge, she's ruled in favor of the employers several times. So already we see a pattern here. It's not just being a lawyer and representing your client. When she has to decide, she's voting with the employers. And so guys, no judge should blanket be in favor of discrimination or non-discrimination cases. It depends on the facts. And in favor of labor or employment, it depends on the facts. But the Democrats, let alone the Republicans, are all picking judges with a proclivity to side with employers overwhelmingly. Well, that's just not fair. It's not fair to the average American worker and to this process. So look, almost every article says she's the underdog. There's two other candidates that are very qualified and more likely to be the favorites, which then gives you a good indication. If she winds up winning, it was Clyburn working with Republicans to screw over the Democratic agenda yet again and hand it over to business interests that pay Clyburn, literally pay his campaign donations. They give him millions of dollars and he works for them. Now the reporters say, oh no, you can't say that about Clyburn. Why not? I just said it. I can say it about any politician. Almost all of them are corrupt. They all take the money. It's not, why would Clyburn randomly hate the average American worker? He gets paid to be against your interests. That's why he does it. So the dead giveaway is him saying we need Republican permission. That means my donors have spoken and I'm gonna push in this direction. And you know what? The more I read it, the more I thought, we're screwed. Because all Clyburn and Manchin have to do is just put their foot down. and Biden will immediately give them this pick instead of a much more qualified and much more fair pick. There's two excellent, apparently, African-American women. I say apparently only because I've read only a little bit about them, but there's great evidence that they are fair. And instead, of course, the worst Democrats in the country are working with the worst Republicans in the country to pick someone who's going to be unfairly in favor of business. Thanks for watching The Young Turks, I really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR, so those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.